Welcome to the Bible Untold channel. When we think about the people who knew the God of Abraham, our minds quickly turn to Israel, Moses, the desert, Mount Sinai, and the Ten Commandments. These stories form the backbone of our spiritual understanding. According to the common telling, it was in these moments that Yahweh revealed himself to his chosen people. But what if this story stretches back further than we've been taught? What if, before Moses ever heard God's voice from the burning bush, others had already knelt before him? What if Yahweh was already known and worshipped by people who have been forgotten by our traditional accounts? This isn't just guesswork, it's an invitation to look deeper than surface-level tradition, beyond what we've always accepted as the beginning. Real solid evidence exists that the God of Israel was called upon by other voices long before the Exodus. We're talking about ancient people from harsh, dry mountain lands who knew the sacred name. Simple folk, yet deeply spiritual, who called upon Yahweh, honored the Most High, and tried to live by his teachings long before Israel became a nation. Could it be that faith in Yahweh first took root among other peoples, only to flower later with Israel? Was the eternal God known since ancient times by those now forgotten by history? This discovery doesn't contradict Scripture, it enriches it, showing that God has always been the God of all peoples. His sacred name doesn't belong to just one family line, but has echoed since the world began, whispered by righteous people among all nations. If this touches your heart and awakens a hunger for deeper truth, please like this video. Share your thoughts in the comments and send it to someone who loves exploring the mysteries of the Most High. Today we rediscover a forgotten chapter of God's story with humanity. The desert wanderers, the Shasu people. They came before the Israelites, before Moses climbed Mount Sinai, before the stone tablets of the law were given. The Egyptians were the first to record their existence, not with admiration, but with hidden fear. On temple walls, among the hieroglyphs celebrating Pharaoh's glory, there were also words filled with scorn, warnings, and mockery. Shasu was the name given to a Semitic nomadic tribe of herders and warriors who traveled on foot across the desert with their eyes lifted toward heaven, worshipping one deity, Yahweh. Yes, the same Yahweh later worshipped by the Israelites. But the Shasu came first, much earlier. These people of Semitic origin, like many others from the ancient Fertile Crescent, belonged to tribes collectively known as the Hyksos, a term that to Egyptians meant foreigners, invaders, or desert thieves. The Egyptians didn't see them as equals. On the contrary, to the Egyptians, the Hyksos were a nuisance, a plague comparable to lice. But among these foreign tribes, the Shasu stood out not only for their persistence, but for their unusual worship practices. Around 1500 BCE, during the height of Egypt's new kingdom, the Shasu walked the harsh routes of the Sinai, from the Jezreel Valley to the hills of Kelon, like shadows of the desert. It's here that the traditional story begins to unravel. Because these desert men and women already worshipped Yahweh long before the Hebrews were delivered by Moses. How is that possible, a traditional scholar might ask, preferring to keep all records within the boundaries of the Pentateuch? But the truth is carved into Egyptian stone, the names of Shasu tribes linked with the God of Israel. In Western Amara, for example, Egyptian records mention the Shasu of Waichichu, which many scholars consider one of the earliest written forms of the name Yahweh. These people weren't Egyptians. They didn't come from Nubia or the Delta. They came from the Levant, from the eastern edges of the Egyptian world, carried by wind and the will to survive. They organized themselves into clans, each led by a patriarch. Although Shasu was the name the Egyptians gave them, they had other names, ancestral names perhaps connected to figures who were more than ordinary men, patriarchs, tribal leaders, or perhaps go-betweens linking men and gods. The word Shasu, from the Egyptian Shishu, might mean those who walk on foot. Other language experts suggest the term relates to wander or even plunder. But were these meanings given out of contempt or fear? History teaches us that winners write the records, but not always with truth as their goal. What's both troubling and fascinating is that the Shasu, despite their lowly image in Egyptian eyes, carried one of the greatest spiritual secrets of ancient times: worship of one God before such belief became common teaching. This not only challenges the usual timeline of the Abrahamic religions, but also raises a haunting question. Could the Shasu have been the true forerunners of Israelite faith? Evidence suggests yes. If that's the case, then the Exodus as we know it may not have been the beginning, but rather the continuation of a much older story. One in which Yahweh's followers had already been walking for centuries, crossing deserts, surviving persecution, and keeping alive a faith that came before even the birth of Israel's 12 tribes. The Shasu vanished from official records around the time of Egypt's third intermediate period. Some say they blended into other cultures. Others claim they were wiped out. But there are those who believe, with evidence to back it up, that they were absorbed into the Israelite people, bringing with them not only cultural and language practices, but also the name and reverence for Yahweh, the God of a nameless people who would later become the very heart of the West's sacred story. The Egyptian records, first mentions of Yahweh. The first time the Shasu appear in ancient records, they aren't portrayed as allies or friends. They appear as enemies of the greatest empire of the time, Egypt. It was in the 15th century BCE, more than 3,500 years ago, that Egyptian scribes first wrote down the name of this forgotten nomadic people in an unexpected place, on the columns of the Temple of Soleb, built by Amenhotep III, pharaoh of one of Egypt's most powerful dynasties. There, Shasu appears not just as a general term, but as part of a list of enemies of the Egyptian crown. Enemies who lived in the Transjordan region, who crossed the desert, and who surprisingly were known for worshipping a single deity, Yahweh. What few know is that this record was later copied during the reigns of Seti I and Ramesses II in western Amara. In this new version, 6 different groups of Shasu are mentioned. But what stands out, what shakes the foundations of Western religious history, is one particular title, the Shasu of YHW. Yes, Yahweh, Yahu, or even, as some hieroglyphic interpretations suggest, Yahweh, Iru, or Iago, a name not found among the Egyptian gods, a name that would echo centuries later on Mount Sinai. 2 separate Egyptian texts, more than 2 centuries apart, one from the reign of Amenhotep III around 1400 BCE and the other from the time of Ramesses II in the 13th or 12th century BCE, mention this unusual tribe, the Shasu of Yahweh. Michael Stewart, a scholar of ancient Near Eastern language and religious traditions, made an observation that still unsettles the guardians of historical orthodoxy. The hieroglyphic translation of the name YHW found in these texts amazingly matches the sacred tetragrammaton YHWH, the very name of God in the Hebrew tradition. And here lies the real archaeological earthquake. This Egyptian mention predates by roughly 500 years what was previously considered the oldest record of the name Yahweh, found on the famous Moabite stone dated to around 2,800 years ago. This means that the name of the God of Israel, once thought to have emerged only with the rise of Mosaic religion, was already known and worshipped at least half a millennium before the formal biblical narrative. Scholar K. van der Toorn was clear. By the 15th century BCE, the worship of Yahweh was already established among the peoples who lived in the mountainous and desert regions of Edom and Midian. Peoples considered primitive, even savage, by Egyptian and Mesopotamian standards, yet who held a sacred secret perhaps older than any revelation on Sinai. The convergence of biblical and archaeological evidence. It's precisely here that the biblical narrative and archaeological record meet in a surprising, perhaps even uncomfortable way. According to the Old Testament itself, it was in Midian that Moses found refuge after fleeing Egypt. And it was there, among the Midianites, that he met Jethro, the priest of Midian, his future father-in-law. A man who, according to the Bible, taught Moses the ways of God. Read that again carefully. Moses didn't discover Yahweh on his own. He was introduced to him by a Midianite priest. If Israel's faith had a beginning, perhaps that beginning didn't happen amid the flames of a burning bush, but much earlier, among the forgotten clans of the Sha'asu. Among the Semitic patriarchs who crossed the desert, worshipping a god with no image, no statue, no temple. Jethro, a priest of Yahweh, in a land where there were no Hebrews yet. a quiet figure who occupies only a few lines in the Bible, yet carries within himself the weight of an entire spiritual lineage. A strong argument that supports the idea that the Edomites and Midianites were among the first peoples or tribes descended from Abraham to worship the one God is connected to the figure of Job, a central character in the Old Testament. Job is often identified by scholars as an Edomite ruler, a man of great influence in the land of Uz, a territory linked with the region of Edom. His three friends who appear in the book of Job are also presented as descendants of Abraham. One of these friends, Eliphaz the Temanite, is described as belonging to the tribe of Teman, an Edomite lineage. The Edomites, in turn, were descendants of Esau, son of Isaac, and grandson of Abraham and Sarah. The Midianites and other peoples mentioned descended from Abraham through his second wife, Keturah. This shows that both Edomites and Midianites preserved, at least partly, a tradition of faith in the God of their common ancestor. Although it's generally known that over time, many tribes descended from Abraham strayed from the path, adopting idol worship and serving other gods. Both the scriptures and historical records, including Egyptian traditions, point to the existence of groups that kept faith in the true God alive. A notable example is one of Job's friends, a descendant of Shua, son of Abraham with Keturah. Though not a Midianite in the strict sense, he belonged to a related tribe that showed familiarity with and reverence for the Almighty God. This context provides a broader view of how knowledge of the God of Abraham extended beyond the direct lineage of Isaac and Jacob, reaching other branches of Abraham's descendants. Thus, even among peripheral tribes, Abraham's spiritual legacy remained alive, passed down through oral tradition and the religious experience of these peoples. Moses and the Midianites, a deeper connection. In this scenario, one of the most fascinating stories in the biblical narrative is undoubtedly that of Moses. After killing an Egyptian, Moses flees Egypt and finds refuge in the land of Midian, a region that today corresponds to the northwestern part of Saudi Arabia. There, he is welcomed by Jethro, described in the scriptures as a priest of the God of Abraham. This encounter reveals something surprising. Even outside the traditional Israelite lineage, there were priests who still worshipped and served the one true God. By marrying Zipporah, Jethro's daughter Moses forms an even deeper bond with that people and their spiritual heritage. The presence of Jethro as a religious leader among the Midianites, descendants of Abraham through Keturah, reinforces the idea that knowledge of the true God was preserved among them. This detail is an important piece in the mosaic of monotheistic faith in the ancient Middle East. Beyond the Midianites, other peoples of the region also appear to have maintained some form of connection to the Abrahamic faith. The Kenizzites, for example, are mentioned in the Bible with a degree of spiritual closeness. It's plausible that they were descendants of Ishmael through his son Kedemah, which would give them an Arab origin with ancestral ties to monotheism. This becomes even more relevant when we consider Caleb, one of the spies sent by Moses and a faithful companion of Joshua. Caleb is identified as a Kenizzite, suggesting a mixed ancestry, Hebrew and Ishmaelite, reinforcing the idea that faith in the God of Abraham was not limited to Isaac's genealogical line, but was present in various lineages that originated from him. Another noteworthy aspect is the reference found in ancient Egyptian records to the Shasu nomadic groups that inhabited the Transjordan region. These texts place the Shasu in the mountains of Seir, a region traditionally associated with the descendants of Esau, Jacob's brother. The connection becomes even more significant when these same sources mention the Sinai Peninsula, suggesting that both the Edomites and the Midianites were settled in nearby areas and maintained some level of interaction with Egypt. These pieces of evidence reinforce the idea that various branches of Abraham's descendants, not only through Isaac, but also through Ishmael and Keturah, preserved in some form the faith in the God of their forefathers. When we analyze these accounts from a historical and biblical perspective, we see that the monotheism spread by Abraham had a much broader reach than is traditionally assumed. These elements shed light on the presence and spiritual influence of the Abrahamic heritage among the peoples of the ancient Middle East. The broader reach of Abraham's legacy. In ancient times, the Sinai Peninsula was inhabited by tribes descended from Ishmael, as well as by the descendants of Midian, two distinct branches, yet both connected to Abraham. Ishmael, born of his union with Hagar, and Midian, born of his relationship with Keturah, represent family lines that expanded beyond the territorial boundaries of Israel. However, the presence of Keturah's descendants was not limited to the peninsula. Evidence suggests that the influence of these people extended across vast areas of what is now Saudi Arabia, showing that Abraham's lineage had a much wider geographical and cultural impact than is usually imagined. Beyond well-known figures like Moses, Jethro, Caleb, and Job, the Old Testament presents other characters who demonstrate a deep knowledge of the true God, the God of Abraham. One particularly intriguing case is that of Balaam. Although his path in the scriptures is marked by controversy, he appears as someone closely connected to the Midianites and recognized for his relationship with the Most High God. Balaam, although not part of the people of Israel, received revelations directly from God and maintained dialogue with him, making him a unique figure among non-Israelite prophets. Moreover, there are traditions preserved by rabbis and scholars that point to the importance of Beor, Balaam's father. Some of these sources refer to Beor as a king or as the Great Beor, suggesting that he may have held a prominent role as a priest in Midian or even as one of the wise men revered among Semitic peoples outside the Israelite lineage. According to certain interpretations, Beor could have been one of the so-called 7 sages or 7 prophets sent by God to the nations descended from Abraham, peoples who were brothers to the Israelites, and, though outside the Mosaic covenant, kept monotheistic faith alive and preserved part of divine knowledge. These messengers would have served as spiritual guides, helping ensure that recognition of the one true God was not lost among the surrounding peoples. The Shasu and the origins of Yahweh worship. The Shasu people, often overlooked in traditional religious studies, deserve a closer examination. Their name appears in Egyptian records as early as the reign of Thutmose III, around 1479 to 1425 BCE, where they are described as troublesome nomads. From the regions of Syria-Palestine, what makes the Shasu particularly significant is not just their early mention, but the specific reference to a group among them known as the Shasu of Yahweh. This reference appears in 2 important Egyptian inscriptions. One at the Temple of Soleb, built during the reign of Amenhotep III, around 1390 BCE, and another at the Temple of Amara West, from the time of Ramesses II, around 1270 BCE. The inscription at Soleb lists various groups of Shasu, including the Shasu of Yahweh, alongside other geographical designations. This suggests that YW might refer to a specific region associated with these nomads. However, many scholars, including Frank Moore Cross and Thomas Romer, have argued convincingly that YHW is indeed an early form of the divine name later known as Yahweh. What's particularly striking is that these Egyptian references predate the traditional timeline for the emergence of Yahweh worship among the Israelites by several centuries. According to the biblical narrative, it was only during the time of Moses, traditionally dated to around the 13th century BCE, that the name Yahweh was revealed to the Israelites. The implications are profound. If the Shasu were already worshipping a deity called Yahweh in the 15th–14th centuries BCE, then the origins of Yahweh worship might be found not in the Exodus narrative, but in the religious practices of these Semitic nomads who roamed the regions of Edom, Midian, and the Sinai Peninsula. This doesn't diminish the significance of the Mosaic revelation. Rather, it suggests that Moses may have encountered a deity already known to certain Semitic groups, particularly those connected to the Midianites, among whom Moses found refuge after fleeing Egypt. The archaeological evidence further supports this connection. Excavations in the regions historically associated with the Midianites and Edomites have uncovered religious sites dating to the Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age, roughly 1400 AM and 1000 BCE, that show signs of cultic practices distinct from those of surrounding Canaanite peoples. These sites, particularly those found in the Timna Valley and at Khirbet en Nahas, suggest a form of worship that avoided anthropomorphic representations of deity, a characteristic later strongly associated with Yahwism. The Midianite connection, Jethro and Moses. The biblical narrative itself provides intriguing hints about the pre-Mosaic worship of Yahweh. When Moses encounters God at the burning bush in Exodus 3, God identifies himself as the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. This suggests continuity with a deity already known to Moses' ancestors. More significantly, Moses' father-in-law Jethro is described as the priest of Midian, Exodus 3:1. After the Exodus, when Jethro reunites with Moses, he offers sacrifices to God and proclaims, "Now I know that Yahweh is greater than all gods." Exodus 18:11. This statement is remarkable because it comes from a non-Israelite priest who appears to recognize and worship Yahweh independently of Moses' revelation. Some scholars, including William Dever and Thomas Romer, have suggested that Moses may have first encountered Yahweh not through a direct revelation at Sinai, but through his association with the Midianites, particularly through Jethro. This would explain why Moses felt comfortable fleeing to Midian after killing an Egyptian, and why he was accepted into Jethro's family. The Kenite hypothesis, first proposed by scholars in the late 19th century, suggests that Yahweh was originally the deity of the Kenites, a group closely associated with the Midianites. According to this theory, Moses learned about Yahweh from his Kenite/Midianite connections, particularly through Jethro, and later introduced this deity to the Israelites during the Exodus. This hypothesis finds support in several biblical passages. In Judges 1:16, Moses' father-in-law is described as a Kenite. In Judges 4:11, we read of Heber the Kenite, who had separated from the Kenites, the descendants of Hobab, Moses' father-in-law. These references suggest a close connection between the Kenites, the Midianites, and the early worship of Yahweh. Furthermore, in 1 Chronicles 2:55, the Kenites are described as the families of scribes who lived at Jabez, suggesting they played a role in preserving and transmitting religious traditions. This aligns with the idea that the Kenites Midianites may have preserved an early form of Yahweh worship that predated the Israelite encounter with this deity. The broader context: Abraham's legacy beyond Israel. The biblical narrative itself acknowledges that Abraham had descendants beyond Isaac and Jacob. Through Hagar, he fathered Ishmael, who became the ancestor of various Arabian tribes. Through Keturah, his second wife, or concubine, he fathered 6 sons, including Midian, who became the ancestor of the Midianites. Genesis 25:6 tells us that Abraham gave gifts to the sons of his concubines and sent them away from his son Isaac, eastward to the east country. This suggests that Abraham's non-Israelite descendants settled in regions east of Canaan, including areas that would later be associated with the Shasu, the Midianites, and the Edomites. It's reasonable to suppose that these descendants of Abraham would have carried with them some knowledge of Abraham's God. While they may have developed their own religious traditions over time, they might have preserved certain core elements of Abraham's faith, including perhaps the name or title of the deity he worshipped. The Book of Job provides an intriguing window into this possibility. Job, described as a man from the land of Uz, possibly in Edom, is portrayed as a righteous worshipper of God, despite not being an Israelite. His friends, including Eliphaz the Temanite, from Edom, Bildad the Shuhite, possibly a descendant of Shua, one of Abraham's sons through Keturah, and Zophar the Naamathite, all engage in theological discussions that suggest familiarity with the God of Abraham. This broader context helps us understand how knowledge of Yahweh might have been preserved among non-Israelite peoples descended from Abraham. It also explains why figures like Jethro could be recognized as legitimate priests of God despite not being part of the Israelite lineage. The implications for our understanding of biblical history. The evidence for pre-Mosaic worship of Yahweh among the Shasu and Midianites challenges traditional understandings of Israelite religious history in several ways. 1. It suggests that Yahweh was not originally an Israelite deity, but was worshipped by Semitic groups in the regions of Edom and Midian before the emergence of Israel as a distinct people. 2. It implies that Moses' encounter with Yahweh at the burning bush may represent not the introduction of a new deity, but the reintroduction or reinterpretation of a deity already known to certain Semitic groups. 3. It helps explain the ease with which the Israelites, after the Exodus, accepted Yahweh as their God. If some Israelites, particularly those connected to the Levites, Moses' tribe, had preserved memories of Yahweh worship from earlier times, this would have facilitated the acceptance of Yahweh as the national deity. 4. It provides a context for understanding certain non-Israelite elements in early Yahwism, such as the connections to Ser, Edom, and Paran associated with Ishmael, mentioned in ancient poems like Deuteronomy 33-2 and Habakkuk 3-3. 5. It suggests that the biblical narrative, while focusing primarily on the Israelite experience of Yahweh, preserves traces of a broader history in which Yahweh was known and worshipped by various Semitic peoples connected to Abraham. This doesn't diminish the significance of the Mosaic revelation or the unique covenant between Yahweh and Israel. Rather, it enriches our understanding of how God worked in history, revealing himself not only to one chosen people, but to various groups who preserved knowledge of him in different ways. The theological significance, God of all nations. The evidence for pre-Mosaic worship of Yahweh among non-Israelite peoples has profound theological implications. It suggests that God's revelation was never limited to a single people, but was accessible to various groups who sought him sincerely. This aligns with certain biblical passages that hint at God's broader work among the nations. In Amos 9:7, God declares, "Are you not like the Cushites to me, O people of Israel? Did I not bring up Israel from the land of Egypt, and the Philistines from Caphtor, and the Arameans from Kir?" This suggests that God was active in the histories of other nations, not just Israel. Similarly, in Acts 14-16-17, Paul tells the people of Lystra that in past generations, God allowed all nations to walk in their own ways, yet he did not leave himself without witness. This implies that God was revealing himself to all peoples, even if in ways different from his revelation to Israel. The evidence for Yahweh worship among the Shasu and Midianites suggests that God's self-revelation has always been more inclusive than exclusive. While Israel played a unique and central role in God's plan of redemption, God was not unknown to other peoples who sought him sincerely. This understanding helps us appreciate the universal scope of God's love and concern for all humanity. It reminds us that God has always been the God of all nations, even if he chose one nation as the primary vehicle for his redemptive work in history. Conclusion. Rediscovering the broader story of God's work. The evidence for pre-Mosaic worship of Yahweh among the Shasu and Midianites invites us to rediscover a forgotten chapter in the story of God's interaction with humanity. It reminds us that God's work in history is always broader and more inclusive than our limited perspectives might suggest. This doesn't diminish the unique role of Israel in God's plan. Rather, it enriches our understanding of how God prepared the way for Israel's mission by preserving knowledge of himself among various peoples connected to Abraham. The Shasu, the Midianites, Jethro, Job, and others who knew and worshipped Yahweh before the Exodus remind us that God has always been at work in the world, revealing himself to those who seek him sincerely, regardless of their ethnic or cultural background. As we continue to explore the mysteries of God's work in history, may we approach the biblical narrative with both reverence for its divine inspiration and openness to the broader contexts that enrich our understanding of its message. I hope you've enjoyed this exploration of the Shasu, the Edomites, the Midianites, and their faith in the God of Abraham, a faith that in many cases even preceded the formal worship established among the Israelites. We've seen how figures like Jethro, Job, Balaam, and others kept that connection with the Most High alive. If you found this journey through ancient history and biblical archaeology enlightening, please take a moment to like this video, share it with others who might appreciate these insights, and subscribe to the Bible Untold channel. By subscribing, you'll join a community of seekers who are passionate about uncovering the deeper, often overlooked dimensions of sacred history. Your support helps us continue bringing these hidden stories to light, revealing the rich tapestry of God's work throughout human history. Share this video with friends, family, or anyone interested in exploring the mysteries of faith beyond conventional narratives. The Bible Untold is dedicated to examining Scripture through fresh eyes, uncovering forgotten connections, and helping you see familiar stories in new, meaningful ways. Join us on this journey of discovery by subscribing today and never miss another episode that might transform your understanding of sacred history. Thank you for watching, and may God's wisdom guide your path as you continue to explore the untold stories of our shared spiritual heritage.